Charles, before we started
Yes.
recording, you were just telling me the differences now between consulate, High Commission, and embassy. That's really interesting. Just quickly go through that again.
Well, from a British point of view, the distinction between overseas embassies and high commissions and consulates it's interesting now, sort of so many years after the demise of empire, because the fundamental distinction is that a Commonwealth country will have what we call a High Commission, a British High Commission, and therefore a High Commissioner, whereas a non-Commonwealth country will have an embassy, and then a consulate will be a sort of smaller enterprise that doesn't have a diplomatic, or at least not a sort of, I suppose, tier one diplomatic capability, and therefore would be a processing place for visas and passports and that kind of thing. And I think, for me, what we were talking about just before we started recording was that I spent some time in the army working on what was called, ironically, defence diplomacy. I mean, that's sort of not as funny as it sounds, because it is absolutely a thing, and this is part of what gets described as soft power, and there are so many ways in which soft power plays out and sort of is deployed. But I think I wasn't there, but my feeling on it is that, in fact, as time has passed since countries became independent from the British Empire, and I will just pause here to say that I'm not advocating for the continuation of an empire as it was. What I am trying to set out is a case by which, from the outside, or at least partially from the inside in the time that I was there, it seems that the British have really lost a grip on how to relate to other countries. And of course we can go through all the terrible wrongs of the past and all that nonsense that gets exploited now for all sorts of gain on both sides. But I think what I really mean is that even the Commonwealth, I think that the United Kingdom doesn't behave in a properly interested fashion towards those sorts of countries, and I think that's a massive mistake. And so the defence diplomacy thing, which basically means that in some way there's a relationship between the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the Ministry of Defence, in order that there's a British military presence in a particular country. There always is, via the defence attaché or military attaché or whatever he or she is called. But in addition to that, there might be a team that's loosely attached to a High Commission, usually, because this is less so in countries where there isn't a Commonwealth connection. But that involves liaison with the host nation armed forces, and therefore the projection of what is described as soft power via training or sharing of information and this, that, and the other. And it's you can see how this comes into play. I mean, my experience of it was in mostly Eastern but a little bit Southern Africa, and it's evolved absolutely, for sure. But I think also, even in that arena, they've lost grip, and also it's a very competitive space. And I saw this, I'm going back nearly 20 years now, but I saw this the competition between particularly the United States and, in fact, funnily enough, the Nordic countries, in terms of presenting the greatest offerings to these nations in order that you would secure particular concessions to be able to do whatever it is. And then if you do then go and look at, as I say, in my experience, Eastern Africa, what happened particularly in Djibouti was very interesting, which was the Americans' first sort of foot on the ground, was the camp that they put in Djibouti. And then you look at how all the port infrastructure has sort of developed in that region around the Horn of Africa and all the rest of it. So it's a big topic, but it goes back to this, the idea that in some way, the Commonwealth is special. And of course, the one anomaly, the significant anomaly, it's not the only anomaly, but the one very significant anomaly, of course, is that Rwanda became part of the Commonwealth, having not previously been part of, what one might describe as the empire. So anyway, we could go on, but yeah, it's just an interesting point, and I think, like so many things, it's easy just to gloss over what seemed like not terribly significant distinctions, but I think they are significant, but perhaps not so much in the way that they necessarily should be. But you were just talking about, South Africa's relationship with the United Kingdom on that front, and sort of, actually, I'd be really interested to know now, particularly given South Africa's stance on Israel, how do you think relations are between South Africa and the United Kingdom?
No, they're not as good as they used to be. But our relations with most Western countries appears to be deteriorating.
I would like to just jump in here, Jerm, if I may, and say I need to just challenge a couple of things that Charles said there.
Good.
My first question is, did the British Empire end? And I would argue that it didn't, that it just changed into something different. And I mean, one analogy or one comparison we might use is the Roman Empire, for example, which was very much a military operation until it morphed into the Roman Catholic Church, and suddenly it became a soft power operation instead. And I would draw some parallels there. But the other thing that I would just say is that I don't think we should ignore the wrongs, in inverted commas, of the British Empire. I think we should look actually a lot closer at those than perhaps we're willing to. And that is because the actual modus operandi of the empire as it was, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th, well, the late 19th century, let's say mid to late 19th century, we see the same types of activities, the same types of manipulations being used then as we see today. And actually to get an understanding of, I would argue, to get an understanding of the types of things, activities that we see from the so-called deep state, which is an expression of empire, that we need to be actually looking very closely at what the British Empire did and how it maintained its influence in certain countries. If we look at Palestine, if we look at India, or we look at Ireland, for example, just to give three examples, we see the same types of behaviours in each of those theatres, and we see the same types of behaviours from certain factions today, and I think that would help us actually understand what's happening to us now, because we are actually on the receiving end of that. I'm talking about the British people, Europeans, United States. I don't know so much about South Africa, but certainly we are on the receiving end of the same type of manipulations, and I think there's value in being a bit objective, or trying to separate ourselves from what we might see as not quite sure how to put this, but some kind of loyalty to Britain as it was at that time. I'd be interested in Charles's rebuttal of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, good challenge. And I think it is very important to have challenge and to thrash this stuff out. I think, yes, of course, I do agree with what you're saying on both points. I mean, insofar as the empire having ended, I think what I mean by that, or rather, would I be right in thinking that what you mean by that is that in actual fact, the influence that pervades the countries that constituted the empire is, to all intents and purposes, still there? It just manifests in a different way. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's part of it. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
The Commonwealth is a soft power operation, and notionally the Crown is still head of the Commonwealth, but it is certainly, from a deep state point of view, it is certainly one of the channels that we influence the same countries that we were actually physically occupying at a certain point. And I would question the degree of independence that many of these countries or any of these countries have, because we still accept those countries still look up to, in a certain sense, Britain.
Yeah. Okay. No. With that, I would totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I suppose it depends. How many layers one wants to consider there might be in terms of motivation and benefits, perceived benefits, on either side. If one's to imagine that the empire was supposedly benefiting the ruling classes and indeed the state of the United Kingdom during its pomp, then I don't know that one can suggest that the same could be said for the sort of legacy framework now. And I'm really only talking about the sort of the ruling classes part. In that the way I see it is that the communications and the dealings with countries that were formerly part of the empire and do have terrific resources and capabilities that could still be tapped into. I just don't see that that's being done effectively.
I think that depends on what your definition is, because, I would argue that the British Empire was not about the ruling classes. The British Empire was about the City of London, the British East India Company. It was a financial corporate empire that made use of the resources of the state and the cover of it being the British state empire as to cover the activities, the corporate financial activities that were going on, and in fact the deep state was tied into that. If we look at what's going on today, I would argue we're seeing, the coming out of the shadows once again of the merger between state and corporation, and the merger between state and financial institution. It's again changing into something that maybe resembles a bit more of what was going on in the late 1800s. But if that's your definition of what the empire was, then I think what we're seeing today it looks a lot more like that than the idea that it was, pumping up the so-called oligarchy or aristocracy, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I think actually in either situation, though, what I would say is very stark. And funnily enough, we've talked about this before, but the one that, as far as the British were concerned, and I think we do have to be quite specific, because when you consider how other Western nations colonised, the modus operandi was different in each respect. But what characterised the British sort of colonial approach, or at least one of the defining things that enabled so much of what you described, was the development of infrastructure, in order that a lot of the things that had to happen, which did have a bearing on all the finance and banking things, was deliverable. And what is very, very stark, I would say pretty much without exception, is that post-independence, that infrastructure has completely and utterly crumbled, and that therefore has frustrated what one might regard as efforts to continue to benefit the City of London and the bankers, because you do still require things to actually work, and that's the bit that's been lost control of. And then well, I don't want to sort of confuse the conversation, but then it's interesting to look now at how the European Union has sort of inveigled itself in lots of parts of the world, and also China again, and the influence that China's brought to bear. UAE, there, lots of other countries have had the chance to, I would say, come in and to a great extent displace what the British might otherwise still be doing.
So I would push back a little bit on that as well, because of course the infrastructure has crumbled in these countries, but infrastructure has crumbled in Britain and in the United States and in the EU as well, because of course we're in a transitionary economic period where we've abandoned the productive capability that we have, and therefore we don't need that infrastructure. We are turning ourselves into a digital services economy, and alongside that comes the totalitarian digital grid that we are all familiar with, and in fact the restrictions on travel, the restrictions on freedoms that are coming with that don't need that infrastructure either. So I would suggest that it's maybe not as simple as that.
Okay.
You know,
yeah, I mean, I agree with you that that's exactly how it's being put forward. But I think, just considering what Patrick Wood was talking to Jerm about the other day, we're to an extent talking about technocracy and the idea that that's how the situation can run. Of course, it's still unproven. And let's just think about something we were covering on, well, not you or me, but that was dealt with on Wednesday's news programme this week, was lithium, for example. There's constant bang on about, whether it's rare earth minerals or this, that and the other. All of this stuff, despite the fact, yes, it is digital and therefore it's apparently not tangible. Of course, it is. There is a massive amount of infrastructure and resource requirement for this. And I think that is totally overlooked. The idea that this stuff can just build and build and build without there needing to be an improvement, if this is to actually play out, without there being an improvement in the way in which that happens. Because at the moment, for example, the United Kingdom's plan for digital everything has got holes a mile wide in it, because they don't have the materials to be able to do what it is. And that's why I do go back, and it's to sound sort of mundanely pragmatic, but I do think that one cannot ignore the requirement for an infrastructure that does deliver whatever it is, however conceptual the final point actually is. There are still people and things that need to be in place for that to happen. And that's the bit that I see as having changed so radically from the days of empire. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the East India Company or whatever it was, but the system underneath which the banking operation sat was a well-oiled machine, and I don't see that is the case now. So I totally agree that that's absolutely where we seem to be going as a country. So this is not exclusive to the empire as it was or is, but I think the idea of a collapse is something that people really do have to consider, but in every regard.
I mean, I would completely agree with everything you said there, Charles. I would argue that the empire that was, and as I say, that I would argue still is in a state of collapse, and an expression of that, of course, the empire can only be built on people, and what we have seen, of course, in the last 100 years is a collapse in standards right across the board. So inevitably, the expression of empire that we see is in a state of collapse. They make bad decisions. They make wrong decisions. They don't recognize the need for, as you say, the fact that they do still require infrastructure if they're going to develop this digital control grid. At every level of society, we see this collapse in intellect and ability. And so inevitably, whatever the expression of empire that we have is going to come in the same type of, we're going to see the same type of collapse, I would suggest.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, in a sense, it seems to me like we're sort of talking about the same thing, but from perhaps slightly different angles, in that we're both talking about collapse. And I suppose, yes, to be fair, what I'm describing by collapse means that my perspective is that that's a failure, is that therefore suggests that actually Britain has lost, the United Kingdom has lost the grip it once had. But I mean, it's in a way a slightly more semantic point on the issue of recriminations and how awful all this was. I really was only talking about the way in which that relates to the very dull sort of sometimes overt political discourse and the egging on of countries to call for reparations and the church getting involved. And it just the type of thing that is just so utterly pointless, frankly, and it doesn't in any way address any of the things that you're actually talking about. So it's totally superficial, and it's great because diversionary. It's totally and utterly, and you think of how that then pushing on to something like slavery and how like the National Gallery or the National Portrait Gallery. I think now, for a number of years. It's certainly on the website. I can't remember if it's beside their paintings. Every single portrait or painting has a sort of, it's almost like a fact check of whether or not the artist or the subject of the painting or whoever commissioned or paid for it had any links to slavery. And you think, okay, if all the things. What is there anything else you'd like to write about it? No. We'll just concentrate on that one thing. And of course, by slavery, they only meant the slavery of I always describe sort of African people. I mean, it's just so unbelievably superficial and narrow and inflammatory. But so I think that's really what I meant. But no, I mean, otherwise, gosh, I would totally agree. And we talked. I think it was last week. Absolutely, we're talking about the Roman Empire and all of it. I mean, it's endlessly fascinating. And in fact, Jerm, again, this came up to a certain extent with E.M. Burlingame on the idea of civilizations and that kind of thing, and how this idea of sort of power and influence persists, but through the people. And I thought that was very interesting.
Well, Mike, do you not think that there is a case to be made, as difficult as it might be, for empire?
No, I don't. I don't think that because what's the cost for that? And I really find that a hard argument to agree with. It comes back to the famous scene in The Life of Brian where they're talking about what did the Romans ever do for us, and of course aqueducts and all this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, okay, but one of the things we got to remember is that the reason that infrastructure was built was to make the trading and effectively the rape of the countries possible. The idea of the modern nation state is based on the principle, it comes from the Treaty of Westphalia, it's based on the principle, if you look at the first clause of that treaty, it talks about each nation operating for the benefit of the other, and through that comes peace. And this is the basis of the modern nation state. Now, that is totally anti-empire, because if you're recognizing that peaceful coexistence comes from the fact that you can benefit as a nation from helping your fellow nation benefit, that is a very different approach to going into a country, colonizing it, installing an infrastructure, installing a legal system that suits you, and withdrawing without giving any decent compensation, withdrawing the raw materials from that company so that you can profit and build your productive capacity. Right? There's two very different approaches there, and I think that for all its faults, and I'm not denying there are many faults with BRICS. BRICS seems to be more aligned with the Westphalian principle than other forms of I don't even want to call it empire, because I'm not sure that it is. But if we believe in the idea of peoples and nations having sovereignty, then they have to be allowed to develop independently. Now, we can assist with that development as long as it is a bilateral assistance and not a unilateral assistance, and that would be my answer to that. This is a long conversation, but I think that there is strength in people who come from a common background and have common outlook, working as a nation. I mean, this is the whole principle of a nation. That's a lot of, that's where a lot of the strength that we have comes from, having a common basis for what we're doing, whether that's is at a family level or a community level or a nation level.
But I think that's where the conflict starts arising, is at what point.
No, in what sense?
Well, for example, China has 1.5 billion people. I mean, that's not even a nation. That is now just an entire civilization. But then you could compare that to, say, I don't know, Liechtenstein, which has 40,000 people.
But that's based on the implication that people have to be managed, and you know that gets into a whole conversation about what our form of governance should be. But you know, I think that the principle that we're talking about here is one where we, no matter what size of organizational unit that we have, that we're looking at our neighbours and we're looking at them as friends, not in competition, that we've got to blatter them over the head with a big gun and make sure that they keep low while we rise to the top. That we can, that we can actually cooperate and function and recognise that other groupings, no matter what size they are, might have something to bring to the party, and that we can work together to, you know, and this comes back to this issue of whether we can actually outgrow the whole issue or concept of geopolitics and think more in terms of a genuine recognition of and a genuine respect for the differences that we have, and that those differences might actually bring solutions. But that only works if we are prepared to consider people from other countries or other groupings as friends, rather than people that are just trying to steal our lunch.
Well, I was just going back to I don't mean to be too much of a pedant, but might use the word assist, and I was going to ask, what you're talking about, relationships between countries and the notion of assistance. I was just wondering what you meant by that, how you sort of see that.
I can't remember what I said now. What?
Okay. Annoyingly, I can't remember exactly what you said either, so we'll have to listen back on
what Mike was saying. What Mike was saying is that instead of going into those regions, colonizing and imposing your politics and your beliefs, etc., you rather allow them to grow. And if yours is more advanced than theirs, then you assist.
And so you're asking what I mean by assist?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I mean, okay, cooperate, whatever term we want to use, but you know, the thing is that we're not going in with guns and saying, right, this is the way it's going to be. That actually we do have to respect the approach. So, you know, if a country that we consider to be, you know, a bunch of uncivilized heathens, if we view them that way, and therefore we have no respect for their wish to live in a particular way with a particular lifestyle, you know, then we may have a tendency to go into that country and say, no, this is the way you've got to do it. And if you don't want to do it that way, tough luck, because we've got the guns and you don't. This isn't the right approach. That's not cooperation. You know, it begins with respect for the culture that exists in another part of the world. And if the answer from them is no, then the answer is no, and we should not be wading in with our boots just because they have a particular rare earth under the ground.
Okay. Yep. Good. The reason I ask is because, again, slightly going back to where we started the conversation, with regard to all the various projects that, in particular, the United Kingdom has running in countries all over the world under the apparent heading of assistance, and having been in a position where I've supposedly been providing that sort of assistance, my question, not just now but even at the time, was always to consider putting the boot on the other foot and imagining why it would be that people, wherever they may be, would consider that they actually want assistance and what the purpose of such a thing might be. And I would say, of course, I totally agree with you. I mean, the idea of just sort of tipping up somewhere and saying, right, we'll have that, and we've got guns, so just keep quiet, or indeed, make us an offer, whatever it is. I think honesty, frankly, and it should be no different from a transaction between an individual. If somebody has got sort of lovely carrots or marrows in their garden and you want them, and you say, right, well, I'd be interested in in some of those. What would you like for them? Why should we regard that just because we are supposedly, and I absolutely say supposedly, more developed, more civilized, more powerful, whatever qualification, that somehow gives us the right to first of all consider that we can get what we want, but also that we sort of have any kind of a right to do anything other than simply declare honestly to whichever not even a country, a region, whoever is controlling a particular resource that we're interested in. Why? And I appreciate this sounds hopelessly naive, but really to consider that anything other than saying we really like your X, Y, and Z. Would you like to enter into some sort of mutually beneficial agreement? And I think this goes back to what I've observed with the post-empire countries, is that bit. And okay, we of course, if one considers that all of it's to an extent intentional, then fine, that explains it away. But I don't think that is the case for absolutely everybody. Certainly not on the corporate spectrum, where actually maximising profits is what matters. But the cack-handed way in which people try to negotiate and make arrangements in order that they can try to satisfy both parties is just woeful. But it's so flipping obvious. You're quite right. You don't have the guns. You don't have the inherent suggestion that somehow you're better. But nonetheless, the without corruption, without the pouring of significant amounts of money into the pockets of people that shouldn't be taking control of it, very little of this would be possible, because the absolute lack of respect for the simple process of coming to an arrangement that satisfies both parties. And that is exactly where we should be with it. So going back to your question, Jerm, as to whether empire can be good. I mean, I don't see how. I mean, I said earlier that the British Empire was characterised, by a lot of things, but one of the great legacies has been the road, rail, shipping networks, which given the time at which they were done and the terrain and all the rest of it, are absolutely extraordinary. Of course, almost all now totally redundant and broken. But unless those were going to be of significant benefit for the people that were living in those places, then frankly, none of that should have happened. What use does somebody living in, well, let's say Eastern Africa, sort of in the interior, have for a railway? Unless it is simply to dig stuff out the ground, take it back out. And what are they going to get out of it? Supposedly, education, voting. But of course, that's tax and control. So yes, I mean, I'm afraid to say I don't see that. I don't think there's such a thing as a sort of benevolent empire. And we go back to the idea of the Monty Python. What did the Romans ever do for us? Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. They laid the template. They set out the means by which all of these things can be done, and further carried out by others along the way. I mean, to an extent, the Normans, and that the baton was simply picked up in the sort of early or pre-Victorian period, and rolled out again. So the only well,
in fact, Charles, you can let's pick a time in history where we start. If we look at the original Silk Road. The original Silk Road trading empire was, as far from the European side, was based in Venice and the Lombard area. This created a banking system which was known as the Lombard banking system. You go to the City of London now, you see Lombard Street, you see, and you see all these references back to that original Venetian empire. And so you can actually follow that as it moved westwards from Venice and through the Dutch and the Netherlands and the Dutch East India Company into the City of London and so on. So, this is it's a continuous process rather than sort of an empire collapsing and reforming somewhere else. It has moved across the world. So it's ended up in London, and now it's sort of headed, in more recent decades, headed west, so that you can't ignore the Wall Street part of that as well. But nonetheless, it's still there as it was.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would totally agree. I mean, I'm simply talking about sort of rehashing the same template. I'm not specifically saying that's British, but I mean, no, it's fascinating. I think when one examines it in those terms, it's everywhere. It keeps rolling. Yeah, but I just I don't see that that one can ever say there are perceived benefits for the whatever they're called, the sort of the victims or the nations that end up having this superimposed on top of them. And I mean, but Jerm, I mean, do you have sort of examples?
Just before you ask Jerm this, I'd just like to make one other point, and that's this whole issue of British, because a lot of people, of course, get very sensitive about once you start accusing, because maybe we're British ourselves, we sometimes get upset about it being attached to the word British. And I just want to, before we move on, make the point. There's quite an astute observation by David Scott, and that was that we have an occupying power in this country, and we should perceive it as being parasitic in nature. So it's not British. It's not an expression of the British people. It is something that has been imposed on this country at this point in time. And maybe if we recognize that, we can begin to think about ways that we might want to deal with it. Sorry.
What was your question, Charles?
Oh, just whether with your question about empire and there being any benefit from it. So I was just wondering whether you had a sort of counter, whether you could see a way in which it can work.
I largely do agree with your comments. I was obviously asking for the sake of devil's advocate.
Yeah.
However, and this is obviously perhaps a more personal tug of war, but I am a result of effectively the British Empire's expansion. My parents too, and my grandparents, and in fact the entire Afrikaner nation, if you think about it. And so if there are no perceived benefits, then it kind of negates quite a lot of stuff that matters to us. Now, things are what they are, obviously, and you can't reverse anything. So then I guess the conversation comes around to what happens next. So South Africa, for example, is no longer part of the Commonwealth, but I think Canada and Australia still are. Should they, in essence, disconnect from the Crown?
I think that's not a question that we can answer. That is something which is absolutely for the people of those countries. But I mean, on the, I'm also a product of that expansion in a sense, because I come from Northern Ireland, Presbyterian family. We were sent there as part of various settlement operations in the. In fact, I can't even remember exactly when our family ended up in that country. But the point is, you're asking where does that leave you? And I think this is a tricky thing. I think it becomes what we're seeing in terms of the sort of pressure for reparations, or the pressure for the pressure on the Afrikaans nation within South Africa and so on, is just a continuing expression of the same types of divide and conquer tactics that we've seen from empires in the past. The fact of the matter is, you are there, and you've been there for whatever number of years. That it would be incorrect, in my opinion, to then say, well, you've no right to be there anymore, so get out. this would not be the right thing to do. I think we've got to start recognizing that black, white in South Africa, or Protestant, Catholic in Ireland, or whatever it happens to be, we have been on the receiving end of manipulations of a different type of people, and that actually we are all the victims of that, in a sense, and we shouldn't be actually even thinking about it in terms of victimhood anymore, in my opinion, but we should be recognizing that we are friends and the enemy is something different, and we should be coming together on that basis, and not resorting to falling into the same old trap which is imposed on us by them, to believe that somehow we are enemies. And so, I think we got to start recognizing what has happened in a slightly different way over the last few hundred years, and recognizing who the instigators of that have been, and who actually has been on the receiving end of those activities, and maybe we recognize who the real enemy is at that point.
Yeah, but what about Israel, for example? We know that there are many commentators who we personally know who will argue against the existence of Israel. But people who are born our age now in Israel, it's not their fault what happened in the 1940s.
No, but they have to. They currently do not. They're currently the people that are pulling the triggers, Jerm, and so they have to begin by recognizing what it is that they're pulling the trigger on behalf of. And they've got to, in my opinion, they've got to stop doing that, and they've got to stop doing it yesterday. And they've got to actually recognize that the people that they're pulling the triggers on have rights. So that's where that conversation begins. But I'm afraid I agree that state of Israel actually does have no right to exist as it's currently constituted. Now, what you do with the people that live there, that's a different question. But the entity itself does not have a right to exist. It would be my personal opinion, because it is a creation of British manipulation.
Are there other examples, do you think? Obviously there are. Sorry, let me rephrase that. What other examples are similar to Israel? I think South Africa is quite different. Because we are talking about empire and the expansion.
No, you could look, Jerm, you could argue that every border in Africa was a creation of empire, and that it's all fake. I think that there is very much an argument for saying to people, well, this border was drawn in order to inflame tensions between peoples, tribal groups, whatever it happens to be in Africa. If we're taking Africa as an example, and we need to say to people, what's your view of this? Do you feel that you're part of the Zulu nation or some other? I don't know the names of many of the nations in Africa, but the question is, do those borders get redrawn, or do people now have some kind of feeling of connection to the entity that they happen to be surrounded by? But that happens through conversation rather than conquest at this point. It would be how I would argue for it.
US also.
Well, the United States, no matter how you look at it, the United States has a lot of things to be proud of. It's got a lot of things to be absolutely ashamed of, and the effective genocide of the native peoples and the continuing suppression of those peoples is something that has to be addressed. I think there's no question about that. The question is what you do about it. That starts with a conversation, and it's not about sort of the types of reparations that we're talking about. It's how to looking to the future and what happens in the future. I think what's happened has happened, and you don't solve that problem by just by throwing money at the issue. Because if you throw money at the issue but don't resolve the fundamental problems that exist, then you're not actually solving anything.
But this goes back to something that you have said a number of times, Mike. that we need to take responsibility firstly at our individual level, and then at our family level, and then at our community level, because when we have those conversations on the ground level, that is where we have influence. We don't really have influence over what's happening at the top.
We don't have direct influence. But I've said many times that the top, whatever that is, has no direct capability to control world affairs. It has to use various layers of middle management.
What I'm saying is that the expansion of various empires has never come from people on the ground. It's come from the top, using the people on the ground.
That's right. So we've got to have we've got to recognize that and make a decision about whether we want to be involved in that or not. And the same goes for whether we want to go to fight in a war, for example. The government of the day says, well, we're going to have a war with country X. So you've all got to join up and you've all got to get involved and whatnot. Well, if we look at the First and Second World Wars, there were a few people that were not prepared to do that. And they found various ways and some of them in the First World War didn't survive as a result, because that was something that was viewed very dimly by the state. The Second World War still viewed pretty dimly, but at least they weren't shooting anybody, as far as I'm aware. Correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, but countries can only prosecute wars abroad if, at this point in time, if people are willing to go and take part in those. Of course, we're seeing that change in the next decade or two, because more and more autonomous and remotely controlled, computer-controlled, AI-controlled capability is being developed, and I think that is a step that we definitely don't want to be going in.
We don't, but I think we should reserve judgment as to how that would actually play out.
Yes.
I think there's such a ridiculous sort of hyperbole surrounding all that kind of thing, and the notion that just because in what's become sort of conventional warfare, if you have control of the air and then you can begin to assert dominance over particular pieces of ground, whole ground, and how you shape the battle space as a result. The idea that this can be done remotely or autonomously, and that there can be an enduring effect, I think is a complete misreading of the situation. I think you can create devastating sort of human casualty with these sorts of things, and I think we're specifically talking about, let's say, drones for the time being, because they're in relative terms sort of cheap and easy. But in terms of enduring effects, I would be I'd be very, very doubtful about that. And okay, everywhere is different, of course. I would cite, say, Afghanistan over the period 2001 onwards, and how utterly failed any effort was at what was called ground holding. The operations there that were described as being to, let's say, liberate and then take control of and redevelop a particular area were, I think, without exception, utterly hopeless. I think people have a massive tendency to underestimate how difficult this sort of thing is and what it really means. So I don't know whether, beyond the initial horror of casualties, I don't know whether any of these effects will be felt in a sustained context. I'm afraid I'd rather doubt it, actually. But sorry, Jerm, just go back and just to qualify. I mean, I'm not suggesting I struck a personal nerve, but I do think it's very important to make a distinction. No. But it's a point very, very much worth making, because first of all, it brings out the sort of nebulous question of, well, I mean, how far do we go back with all of this? And that's a perennial problem to a certain extent. So one wants to try to be consistent, and I think you're very, it's very apposite to bring in Israel, for example. I think that absolutely is a totally different situation, which we probably haven't got time to quite go into, but I'm sure that people who've certainly followed UK Column and listened to this podcast for a period of time and understand exactly what I mean by that. And I think there is absolutely a distinction to be drawn between the banking and corporate influences and then the state activities in terms of sort of colonial subsuming of countries into an empire, and then the settler communities who go there to, I would say, do the part that I was talking about earlier, which relies on mutual benefit. You can't simply, I mean, by and large, let's say all of the parts of Africa that were settled in by Europeans, agriculture was the absolutely the main practice of that, and you can't make that work without there being a benefit for the people who are there, nearby. So no, I do, and I don't mean to sound inconsistent, but I do absolutely make a distinction for that. And okay, yes, to an extent, I'm motivated to say that by my own, personal experiences insofar as how I've seen it play out, and from having spent, admittedly not in recent years, but having spent some time in South Africa, in a few parts of the country, and seen the relationship between the progeny of those settler communities, effectively the relationship between white and black people, with which I have absolutely no issue. I mean, we're always going to be able to find exceptions to that, but the way in which those people rub alongside each other is it is fantastic. I mean, it's heartwarming, and I don't mean that in a patronising sense. I mean, I'd be equally delighted if white people in the United Kingdom behave like that towards one another. But there's such a level of sort of mutual love and respect, and I've seen that all over, sort of southern and eastern Africa, where there are these still white, the today's iteration of white settler communities, and they would not have been able to survive had they not been acting in such fashion that meant that their operations were working and perceived to be working in the eyes of people who, let's say, had been there first. But as I say, then we're falling into the, well, how far back do you go thing, because ultimately we've all come from somewhere else. So I think that's worth saying. And also we do have to be quite specific about these things, because funnily enough, actually a conversation I was having yesterday was about just kind of interesting distinction between, say, the way that manifested in Africa as opposed to in India. There is a popular, in terms of people, there is a legacy in, say, India, but it's completely different. The Anglo-Indian community is not in any way comparable to what has remained in Africa, and that is a sort of talking point. It's an interesting thing. So I don't think one can be generic or universal about any of these things. So to be very specific about South Africa, no. I mean, you can point to isolated incidents, but no. I mean, essentially, I see no issue with the settler practice and mentality. And I'm sure there will be people who will react against that, and that's completely fine. But that is the way I see it.
Just quickly, as we're coming for a landing, nice way to circle back to the start of the conversation. We were chatting about embassies and consulates, etc. Charles, do you think that that countries should have visa applications? Hong Kong, for example, doesn't require a visa for most countries, but like coming to the UK, I have to apply for a visa, which means that I can be rejected.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's something in which, or at least examining that, gives a really good insight into the terrific small-mindedness and pettiness of ministers in the British government and indeed the sorts of corporate leanings on them, because it's a little bit like the sort of Trump tariffs. I mean, it's a tit for tat, and this has been going on for forever. You know, a particular country will make a new policy on the visa requirement or the entry charge for a British national to go to that country, and then the next thing you know, that the situation has been flipped the other way. So I think the whole thing is absurd. No, I personally, I don't think there should be any requirement. I mean, I think we know now, without biometric guff, it is perfectly possible to keep a record of somebody that goes into a country when they go across the border, and to put you through the process of all that investment of sort of time and effort to say that, yes, we think that it's appropriate that you come here and all this. No, I mean, I think that's completely wrong, and that in a way that goes back to the heart of what we're talking about, which is this element of there being mutual respect between countries. And what does that say? What does it say if you're saying to one country, yeah, come on, in you come, we're not going to check anything, do what you like, and then to another you're saying, no, we're going to do our level best to keep you out, but we still want to have access to all the good bits in your country. I mean, that's a ridiculous message to be sending.
I'm sure you agree, Mike.
Absolutely.
Good. There we go.
Well, with that in mind, I still had to apply for a visa, but with some good fortune, I won't be arrested, and I'll see you gents in a couple of months' time.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is good luck wherever you're coming into, whether it be Heathrow, well, whichever airport. Good luck. I mean, this is it. Go back to how all these things have collapsed. I mean, I know this sort of sounds silly in a way, but I am so embarrassed by the state of the larger, English airports and the way in which they treat people. It is appalling, and yet we have the temerity to in going back to the word that Mike used, to say that we can assist other countries with matters that they might not be able to manage themselves. We can't run a flipping airport. It is a joke. I think we've talked about this before. We probably have, and sorry to chuck that in now. But really, if you're going to be put through all that to get a visa, you should be impressed by what you see. You should feel that's that you're sort of recompensed in kind, and I'm afraid that's just. That's not how it is. Anyway, obviously to be enjoyed. Make sure you're overwhelmingly cheerful and see how many responses, appropriate responses you get from anyone in the airports you go through in this country, I would say.
Mike and Charles, thank you for joining me in the weekly trenches.